This is Popular Front, a podcast focused on the niche details of modern warfare and underreported conflict with me, Jake Hanrahan. Today we're speaking to independent journalist Jared Olson. He's going to talk to us about his time reporting in Honduras, specifically about the Narco-Paramilitaries there that have a grip on the poorest people in the country. It's a very bad situation. Jared's going to explain more. If you like what we're doing here at Popular Front, please do consider supporting us at patreon.com/popularfront. Remember, we don't take money from corporate investment funds or any governments, so the way we stay afloat is the Patreon. So you've been doing a lot of work in Honduras. Obviously, this situation there has been volatile for quite a while, but it's like a very underreported situation around there right now. Maybe just explain to us what it is you're doing in Honduras, why you're reporting there.
Yeah, so I'm an independent journalist who's been reporting in Honduras for about 2 years now, really consistently for like 9 months, right? And the context that people need to understand about Honduras, I would say there's two things really. One is that Honduras has been in a constant state of crisis since a 2009 military coup that was quickly legitimated by the United States. It wasn't orchestrated by the United States. It was orchestrated by the Honduran military and oligarchy in June 2009 that basically turned the country into what is now referred to as a narco-dictatorship. The government, the ruling party, is controlled by drug traffickers. Extrajudicial killings abound. It's one of the most corrupt countries in Central America. And because of that, what Hondurans refer to as a narco-dictadura, narco-dictatorship, the total combination of drug traffickers and the government, there's no difference in Honduras. Honduras is ground zero for undocumented migration to the US. 1 out of every 5 people apprehended by Border Patrol this year thus far, and fuck Border Patrol, is Honduran, right? And that's because the conditions are so violent, so despairing in the country. There's a sense of utter despair that has grown out of that social context. And meanwhile, you have this government that, to try to maintain its projects, has begun creating not only elite military units, which is openly known, but this underreported issue, those same military units are creating paramilitary units that are killing people actively.
Right, and before we go into the paramilitary side of it, which I'm particularly interested in, why is it that the Americans went, yeah, sure, we're going to completely legitimize this military coup? Because obviously they've obviously had a hand in a lot of military coups throughout history, we know that. But generally there are some military coups that they go, no, bad, but this one they've gone, yeah, good, that's fine. Why is that?
I think what it was is that, first of all, I don't think you can overlook the fact that Honduras has traditionally been like a base of U.S. power in the region, right? Like ever since the 1980s, there's a couple of massive U.S. military bases in Honduras. And they really their main goal here, aside from maintaining geopolitical control and also facilitating an environment for transnational capitalism, which we know the U.S. likes, they just want stability, right? So I think that honestly, they looked at this coup and they said, we don't care. They basically had a slap on the wrist of the people who orchestrated the coup. So very briefly, they cut off aid. The IMF, the World Bank cut off aid. And the US said, we denounce this and promote a return to democracy. And then within 6 months, they were back pumping funds to the new post-coup government. And they had diplomatically recognized them, even as that post-coup government was already in 2009, 2010, engaging in mass human rights violations, torture, extrajudicial killings, and as people were starting to flee the country more. And one thing to add is that, so again, like this is something that I think tankies especially get wrong. They say it's like a CIA orchestrated coup and stuff like that. It's not. It was 99% done by the Honduran military, and that's a whole other context into why they did that. A president, I interviewed him once, Manuel Zelaya, was a liberal president, not even a leftist or progressive, but a liberal president who had raised the minimum wage and decided to join ALBA, the Venezuelan-led oil alliance, Venezuelan Brazilian led oil alliance. They decided to get rid of him for those reasons, right? So that being said, people say like it was mostly done by the Hondurans, but there is evidence to suggest that there were officials in the State Department who knew about the coup beforehand and greenlighted it. And they said, go ahead, you can do it. And then after the fact, they gave him a slap on the wrist, said, we support democracy, denounced this. But then once people forgot, they went back to supporting them. So that's how you have what's going on now.
Right. So it's like the US didn't orchestrate it, but they just went, yeah, nice one, go ahead. We've got no problem with it.
Basically, yeah. And as soon as, because Honduras is small, unfortunately, like so many places in the world, right? And as soon as kind of critical media attention drifted away, I think they were very smart about it. They just kind of quietly resumed aid. World Bank, the IMF, began supporting projects again in Honduras. The Pentagon started collaborating again. I mean, they never really stopped collaborating with Honduran military forces, but all this sort of aid, military and financial, resumed very quietly and very quickly. And I think they knew what they were doing, you know?
Right. So who was the kind of coup leader, and what's the position of the, obviously it was a military coup. How is it then that they just went, right, now we're the government? Like, how did that transition? What came from that?
Yeah, so basically there was no single coup leader, although arguably one, you know, some people in Honduras would say that the guy pulling the strings all along is the current de facto dictator who might get voted out. Was supposed to leave this Sunday in the elections, but that's where things get dicey, right? Juan Orlando Hernandez, who's been named in a U.S. court trial as a state drug trafficker. But yeah, I mean, this is a huge contradiction where the Pentagon and the State Department are supporting the same people that the DEA and New York City prosecutors are saying are state drug traffickers, like utterly contradictory. But there was no single coup leader, right? It was, again, the oligarchy and the military. But what happened is I knew people who were here, and as well as just a lot of Hondurans who were, you know, old enough at the time, like people who are in their 30s now and were participated in mass protests then. People knew it was coming for several weeks, right? There were things to indicate that there was going to be a coup. The supposed reason of why they did the coup was that President Manuel Zelaya said we're going to have a constituyente, like a constitutional assembly to rewrite the constitution. They painted that as some Trojan horse for communism being brought to Honduras. But the context you have to remember is that in a lot of these Latin American democracies, which are very young and very weak, the constitutions were written by the army in the 1980s with the explicit goal of saying that they were democratic, but protecting the army and making the country fundamentally undemocratic. So that's actually one of the things that one of the candidates nowadays who's about to try to be elected, and we'll see if it works, who knows, wants to do, because they said that they carried out the military coup to stop that. There were other reasons they actually did the coup. It was because the guy raised the minimum wage and wanted to work with Venezuela, right? But when they finally did it on June 28th, 2009, the military showed up at the presidential palace, 5 a.m, 4 a.m, and a bunch of soldiers with M16s basically escorted the president out of the country on a plane. Interestingly, they put him on a plane and they went and refueled at a U.S. military base and then flew him off to Costa Rica. So, and then we have this nightmare for the past 12 years.
Right. Surely, though, these elections, like you just said, this is essentially a narco state, US-backed coup. Like, it doesn't give you a lot of confidence that these are going to be legitimate elections, right?
No, it doesn't. And neither for a lot of Hondurans. Although, I mean, desperation makes people have hope, right? Sometimes. But people are pretty cynical about what's going to happen. Can't say what will happen, but it's not looking too good. There was already an example in 2017 where this is why some people say that the country is already a dictatorship, and everyone says, you know, narco-dictatorship. In 2017, there was an opposition candidate who was set to oust the current president, Juan Orlando Hernandez, the state drug trafficker, who, by the way, is far right, very far right. And he was winning in the elections, and suddenly, late that night of the election day, all of the voting machines had a glitch. And then once the computers came back on nationwide, Juan Orlando Hernandez was winning by a hair. And Yeah, so then there was mass protests, and anywhere from 30 to 80 people were killed in subsequent protests, some getting shot at protests, some by military death squads, right? And Juan Orlando was declared president. So people fear that that's going to happen.
What do you think is going to happen? You've been there, you know the kind of lay of the land right now. What do you expect?
I don't want to. My intuition is that there's a high possibility that a similar situation will play itself out. I mean, just talking to people being here, but also Hondurans themselves, like, major universities, like professors, people who study this, kind of pro-democracy institutions have said, and I recently wrote about this in a piece for Foreign Policy, that there is a very high chance that that is going to repeat itself. And if it does, you're going to see more migrant caravans leaving the country, because with these governments, kind of the narco governments supported by the US, it is utter despair. I mean, there's nothing for people here in Honduras, right? Especially if you're poor.
Yeah. So let's talk about these paramilitary units then. Obviously, with a paramilitary, there is, a conflict. What exactly is the point of these paramilitaries? Why are there so many? And, what's their role in the country?
Yeah, so the paramilitary groups really have to be understood in the context of a certain conflict that has grown out of the last decade since the coup, in the post-coup context, right? The Honduran government, ever since the late 90s and globalization, one of their main cash cows was agribusiness, right? And in agribusiness, especially palm oil, because palm oil, African palm, produces fucking everything, right? It's one of the most lucrative agricultural products in the world, right? So vast swaths of Honduras have been turned into palm oil plantations. The vast majority of them run by oligarchic corporations, such as the Dinant Corporation, which you recognize from the reporting, right? So the paramilitary groups grow out of these conflicts between peasant groups after the coup and the palm oil corporations, right? What happened is that out of this conflict, in the early 90s, the peasant groups, basically, they had cooperative lands that had been given to them in the 70s, the 60s, 70s, and 80s, right? These were just kind of like cooperatively held lands that were given out to the peasants to stop the kind of revolution that you saw taking place in Guatemala, El Salvador, Nicaragua, right? It was a US-backed plan back then. But then when globalization rolls around in the 1990s, the IMF promotes the corporate consolidation of these lands. It's a bit complicated, so I'll leave that aside. And all the peasants lose their land, right? And they're pissed, So they create organizations. They spend the next almost 2 decades trying to get their land back legally. But then the military coup happens, and they still hadn't made any progress, right? I mean, Honduras was still corrupt beforehand. And these groups basically said, holy shit, we're never going to get our land back, right? And we're going to be working for dirt poor wages for this palm oil corporation. So they decided to physically reoccupy their lands. And in the period after the coup, in a place called the Aguan Valley, kind of the heart of palm oil production in Honduras, there was a sustained campaign of assassinations that was carried out against these peasant groups by the Honduran military and the Honduran police, and hired assassins, which were very often tied to one of those two groups, as well as corporate security guards for the Dinant Corporation, which was the main palm oil corporation in Honduras. So out of that context, you have a problem, right? About 150 of them are killed in this campaign of assassinations, which is essentially carried out to put pressure on these groups that physically reoccupied their farms after the coup. Because after the coup, they were like, we can't go through the legal system to try to get our land back. The problem was that the Honduran military got in a lot of trouble for this. It was really obvious that they were killing people. Several human rights reports showed that they were engaging basically in tactics of counterinsurgency to kill off the leaders of these movements and get rid of them. At the same time, the Dinant Corporation, whose guards were killing people and whose guards worked hand in glove with the military, they actually would be given military uniforms, according to many witnesses who've talked to other investigators and myself. The Dinant Corporation got in trouble as well, and the World Bank, which had been funding them, temporarily suspended aid. So they had to think of a new strategy, right? it being harder to directly kill these people via the military, via private security guards, they started creating paramilitary groups, right? It's a bit complex how they created the paramilitary groups, because the paramilitary groups oftentimes are infiltrated, and we get into this a little bit in the reporting, right? They basically planted infiltrators inside these social movements, provocateurs, right? And they were almost always former soldiers or former security guards for this palm oil corporation. And it turns out that these provocateurs, who would usually rise to leadership positions, saying that they would protect these organizations from violence, themselves turned out to be organizing, in the words of the peasants, paramilitary death squads, right? They would go find the kids in the community, the teenagers, and be like, with a revolutionary discourse, say, we're going to protect our community, right? And they would couple them with known assassins who worked for kind of in drug war networks, as well as other former soldiers and private security guards. And these groups were directly supported by the Honduran military. I'm going to limit what I say here, but in one of the largest groups, which we know more about because it's existed longer, called the Grupo de Celio, a special forces commander, Germán Alfaro, was frequently seen with the leader of this group, an ex-special forces officer, Celio Rodriguez, right? And he would come and they would carry out military training of the members of the paramilitary group in this community. But the fact that it was infiltrated meant that they could do two things. They could both kill off the peasant movements, but then from afar, they could say, well, look at the savage, violent peasants. They're just killing each other, right? You know, we stopped killing them because, remember, in the first era, they got in trouble for directly killing them. But these groups were supported by the army themselves and were killing off people. So it was a form of criminalization. So I know that that's a long explanation, right? But now you have these groups, and this is kind of like an emergent strategy. It's only beginning. They've killed 50, 60, 70 people, but there's been no definitive counts. And it's kind of the new strategy to create these third-party groups that can both, A, kill off peasant movements, and then B, from afar, be said to allow people to say, look at how violent they are. They're killing people, these savage peasants, you know?
So this is basically a way for the military to kind of carry out some dirty work on the sly, right? Like the paramilitary units, sounds like that's what they're using them for.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you've probably read about this some, but in Honduras, but also through much of Latin America, but in Honduras after the coup, people talked about the Colombianization of public security, right? This idea that we were going to end up with a situation where in Colombia in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, the army created paramilitary groups. Well, it's complex, but they supported paramilitary groups and worked with paramilitary groups who would do their dirty work, right? And people talked about it right after the coup in Honduras, but then they kind of forgot about it because, you know, people want history to happen fast to prove what they say, but history works really slowly, right? But now, about 12 years after the coup, it started maybe 4 or 5 years ago, very slowly. It's happening. And from what everyone says, this is growing and this is a consistent thing. And we can get more into this, right? But this is the Colombianization of security in Honduras, really.
Right. And you wrote this great article. I was reading it the other day, and it kind of starts with this guy, I think it was his name, Daniel Garcia. He was threatened. Tell me about that. What's the situation with the way that they're kind of threatening what is effectively civilians out here?
Yeah, so basically these groups, you have to understand them not just in terms of killing, although they've killed quite a few people, right? They're essentially, in kind of a granular on the ground level, they're like these state-supported gangs, right? Who are also intimidating people, who are doing everything they can, basically to get rid of these peasant movements, the peasant cooperatives, right? So that includes simple intimidation as well as killing. So this guy, I spent a lot of time in this community, which a peasant cooperative basically reclaimed their land from the Dinant African Palm Corporation, right? But then you saw in the last 3 years the rise of the Santos Torres paramilitary group, right? Which I've got to be careful about how I say some of this stuff. It's got about 30 guys and it follows the same dynamics that we have discussed. It's supported by the military. Photos began circulating of the leader, who was then later killed, Santos Torres, with Honduran soldiers in the region earlier this year, right? So you can draw your conclusions from that. But anyways, this summer, Santos Torres was killed, right? The leader of this group. And all of the evidence indicates that he was killed by the army. The army was actually killing their own guy to be able to basically criminalize their victims. And then the paramilitary group would go kill them, right? So Santos Torres is killed by an army death squad in late June. You see, I talked to a guy who saw the security footage in this community, right? Talks about 4 guys in military uniforms and the other 4 in all black, and they all had M16s. They go into a church and they murder this guy. Right afterwards, you see the effect of this, because then the paramilitary.
Jesus Christ.
Yeah, right. I mean, it's pretty violent. And there are things that I can't say, but just I'll let you and whoever is listening draw their conclusion.
Right, but I totally understand you're out there, but obviously you don't want anyone to come and kind of threaten you, right? That's the kind of issue.
Yeah. I've already had that happen.
Yeah, I can imagine. Yeah, no worries. Understood.
Yeah, definitely. I'm trying to be careful here, right? But anyways, so as soon as this guy is killed, they basically killed him off because people referred to it as a campaign of false positives, because the owners of these groups, the army, and I'll let people decide who else finances these groups, right? Read the article. Non-state actors, very wealthy actors, right? They killed off this guy, and then right afterwards, the paramilitary groups creates a kill list of 5 of the leaders of this small community, right? And they say, we're going to kill all of you as retaliation for killing Santos Torres, even though it was very clearly the army that killed Santos Torres and potentially other members of the paramilitary group. The first of them, Juan Manuel Moncada, is killed within a week, right? He starts receiving text messages and this like taunting invective, right? I talked about that in the article. They basically, no one knows how they get the numbers of these people, but they're small communities and they get it, right? And they generally tell people they're going to kill them, just to kind of torture them psychologically, right? Mm-hmm. This guy, he tried to move between one village and another. He tried to go to a large town in the region to get away, but the paramilitary group tracked him, right? And he was assassinated at a bank within a week of the kill list coming out.
As you were showing in your article, they're like literally sending them pictures of guns, right? Like on WhatsApp, like, hey, like this is what's coming for you, sort of thing.
Yeah, right. So then this is the perfect example. So right after Juan Manuel Moncada got killed and he received these exact same messages, Daniel Garcia begins receiving messages of AK-47s, right? And these guys in, shitty Spanish, because they're all just uneducated assholes. They're saying, this gun is waiting for you. Mm-hmm. You're alive because God is great and powerful, but I don't think you'll have the same luck this week, right? And that same night, a few days after his best friend was killed, and Daniel is on the kill list too, his house is surrounded by these guys with bulletproof vests, AK-47s, and baklavas, right? And they just sit out there, right? I couldn't get this in the article, but they're, they like put laser dot sights on his little adobe walled hut, right? They're torturing him. It's psychological torture. Yeah. And basically he's hiding inside, wanting to die, right? And finally, Daniel and a man who I will not name because he's not asked me to, but he was also on the list. They fled. And then the other 2 members of the list fled as well, right? So the goal was achieved. They got rid of the leaders of the peasant movement, right? But they killed one of them, and then the other 4. Daniel's on the U.S. border right now, about to cross the desert into Arizona. So, they did it, and that's this kind of fucked up strategy that they have to kill off and then scare off the leaders of these groups.
I mean, these were essentially narco-paramilitary groups, right?
I mean, you could argue that the Honduran military is a narco-paramilitary group, but yeah, basically.
Yeah, so then these guys are definitely on that level. How well armed are they? How much kind of hardware do they have? Is it possible that any group you think could rise up against them or not? I'm guessing no, seeing as they, it seems like an extension of the military.
No, I would argue. I mean, I think honestly, and this is a bigger historical discussion, I think the Honduran military, since the coup, has been having wet dreams of like a guerrilla uprising, because that would give them, they could go be Rambo badasses and, finally have a war that they didn't get in the 1980s. But that would also give them the green light to actually get rid of these people straight away and just massacre them. But that tradition really doesn't exist in Honduras, right? they always like to pull these narratives of, these peasant groups are actually, guerrilla groups in disguise. I mean, I've lived and spent weeks in these communities. There's no evidence to suggest that that is true. So they're not rising up. But in terms of the arms of the groups themselves, they're armed with AK-47s, they're armed with M16s, AR-15s, laser dot sights. I mean, that's special, right? But they're nice guns. Bulletproof vests, and oftentimes, and I'll let people draw their conclusions, again, being careful how I say this, they have bulletproof vests that read police and army on them. And in the quote of this one lady who, her son eventually fled too, right? He was threatened. Like, this whole community is getting killed off, scared off. 8 people have officially been killed there, but the number is actually closer to like 15. Another story. She talks about how when the paramilitaries showed up, this summer, after they killed that leader and then started killing people in the community, they're so well equipped. They look like soldiers. You can't tell the difference, right? And I'll let the people listening infer into what that actually means and where they're getting that gear from,
What's the situation then going forward? Like, it doesn't sound good. It doesn't sound, unfortunately, like there's any hope for your average, man and woman in Honduras. Is it just going to carry on being this kind of narco state where America is just like, yeah, we'll allow that to happen? Like, obviously, having the backing of such a powerful country doesn't make it look like anything's going to change. But I don't know. You know the area. You're there. You're reporting there. Is there anything positive that you can see going forward, or no?
I mean, I think that, obviously, like, on the one hand, as a journalist, I'm not here to try to like be an inspirational speaker, right? Like, it's pretty bleak.
Oh yeah, no, of course.
Yeah. I mean, I should rephrase. I know that you definitely don't believe that either, right? No. Yeah, that's definitely not the case. But it's pretty bleak, right? In general, with Honduras, I mean, I've spent a decent amount of time in Latin America, and Honduras, I'm not the only one who feels this way, is like one of the most despairing countries, which is why 1 out of 5 people apprehended at the border are Hondurans, despite it being such a small country. I mean, I think one thing to look at is that in spite of this growing strategy of paramilitary groups, and specifically paramilitary infiltration, right, where they basically create these groups out of the fabric of social movements. This is complicated. We didn't really get into this, but it's complex. They get the infiltrators in the groups, in the movements, right? They start killing people from the inside. People are confused, terrorized, or whatever. But then eventually the groups grow to such a size that they separate entirely, right? And then that's where they become like their own monsters. Anyways, in spite of that, peasant groups in this part of the country that are locked in conflict with the Dinant Palm Oil Corporation have continued to retake their land, right? And that's one thing that objectively I think is, commendable, because they, in spite of the hundreds of killings in the last 10 years and the dozens that have occurred recently, they're still deciding like, okay, we're going to try to organize and go retake our lands. They find their papers from like the 90s from when these lands were taken from them via coercive means. And they go set up these sprawling tent occupations on these farms, these massive plantations, right? And I think that, that just goes to show it's not that you should be like, things are optimistic in Honduras, but people have their lives, right? They're not going to just sit around in despair forever. And they're going to try to collectively fix their problems. And that is something, but the problem is that the strategy is already being used against those new land occupations at the same time. For example, don't mean to go on too long here, but I visited one of these land occupations several times this year. It's called Los Laureles. It's hard to say in English. And basically it's just that, like the peasants reoccupy their land. And they have been besieged by Honduran police and Dinant corporate security guards who fly drones around the plantation at all hours of the day, right? And who go together in joint patrols between the police and the corporate guards, like much of the world, right? It was actually funny when we were there, we were getting followed by this drone that, floated above us all this way around a plantation. But anyways, the people have since told me that, they're trying to maintain their land, they're besieged, right? But that now there are people on the inside of their group there who are being seen with the Dinant corporate security guards, right? and who are creating problems, a group of 4 to 5 young men, which is always the profile, right? Like some 18 or 19-year-olds who, want some money, kind of don't really have morals or whatever. And they're being seen with denouement guards, and it's the beginning. It's already creating problems within that movement. And then recently, 5 bodies were dumped in the region, right? And the origin stories of some of the bodies are a bit complex, right? But it's clear what happened was basically, whether it was the paramilitaries, which I'm not saying anything, or the authorities, or just common criminals, in Honduras, they're the same. It was meant to criminalize this group of people, right? That 5 bodies in rapid succession were dumped around this plantation. So same strategy is being played out. People are trying to take their land back and improve their lives, but then you've got this complex paramilitary strategy that's growing and being used against them.
Right. In terms of just your average man and woman on the street, you're around a lot of them, obviously, with your work. What are their kind of views on the whole situation? What are they saying?
I mean, one of the things I think, is that even within Honduras, a lot of these problems, I mean, I think this is the whole world over, right? Like, you can't expect people to be that aware of their social situation, especially if they're poor, tired, exhausted, whatever. Only in the region of this country where these groups emerge do people really realize what's going on. And even then, it took a while for them to figure out what the fuck was going on, because this was such kind of a sinister strategy, right? Inside, the groups grow out from inside the movements themselves. It confuses the hell out of people. Why are people dying? In that part of the country, people are very well aware that there are paramilitary groups. Ironically, not everyone realizes that they're supported by the authorities, because there's really strong narratives in Honduras, and I think this applies to lots of Latin America, that just say like, oh, the criminality is bad, right? There's just violence and it's there, and, go about your day and keep your head down, right? Even though that criminality is supported by the authorities, but I can't really blame someone who's dirt poor and busy all the time and exhausted from not having an astute analysis of this. But long story short, in Honduras, a lot of people actually don't know about these groups. Only the people who are like direct victims are really aware what's going on.
Really?
Yeah. Like in Honduras, for example, when Santos Torres was killed, likely by the army, likely as a pretext to then have the paramilitaries kill the people we discussed. In Honduras, a few media outlets, they're so kind of clueless on this. They actually described him as a peasant leader and painted him in a nice light, right? Like, oh, this peasant leader was just killed for such and such reasons. And it was all false. That's also fits in with the narrative, right? That just the peasants are violent and inherently violent, and that's just how life is, and that's what a lot of people think, like, oh, out in the countryside, the peasants are killing each other. So yeah, that's kind of how it is. You would think that a lot of people would know, but at this point, it's only like the direct victims who can see with utter clarity what's going on.
Not looking good then. So what about in terms of the elections? What are people kind of saying about them? They're coming up, as you said, in 2 days. What's people's kind of thoughts on them? I imagine it's not particularly positive.
No, I mean, it's like the elections. I wrote about this. I got a piece coming out in actually 45 minutes or something with the LA Times on this. But they capture a lot of the contradictions of the post-coup era, really, because on the one hand, you have Nasri Asfara, who is a far-right candidate connected to Juan Orlando Hernandez. And it's actually really funny because his kind of catchphrase in Honduras is "Papi a la orden," which means "daddy at your service." But anyways, the guy is just a total scumbag, and he had embezzled $1 million. And he's also connected to this political party that consists of state drug traffickers, right? So there's no way that he's not complicit either. And I should say that this political party has been named by U.S. prosecutors as a state drug trafficking organization. So you got Nasri Asfara, the far-right drug trafficker, and then connected to the current president. And then you have the wife of the guy who was ousted in the military coup 12 years ago, Xiomara Castro, right? The wife of Manuel Zelaya. And she's kind of this progressive populist who, I'm not going to get too much into her policies, right? But let's just call her vaguely progressive, right? But people in Honduras are really excited about her because she offers a change that you haven't seen in the last 12 years in Honduras. She says that she wants to go through with constitutional assembly, right, to rewrite the constitution for greater inclusivity. He wants to loosen Honduras's extremely restrictive abortion laws. Basically wants to reverse a lot of the post-coup policies that have kind of driven migration out of the country. The problem is that the National Party, right, the state drug trafficking organization, has so many illegal mechanisms, clientelistic mechanisms to remain in power that there's a chance that they'll be able to just slide by with like bought off votes. I talked to a source 2 days ago who was saying that the National Party was giving out it's third world shit, right? Some people get upset that I said that. But, they were literally giving out stoves and fridges and money to people in the department of Indibuka in exchange for writing down their information and a promise that they would vote for the National Party, right?
Just bribing them with like basic essentials.
Yeah, right. Like a lack of education and poverty means that you can buy people. And even if they can't buy people, which that to begin with is a pretty good strategy, right? The problem is that there are several elite military units. This is aside from the paramilitaries created in the land conflicts. Several elite military units were created by Juan Orlando Hernandez. He basically stewarded their creation, and they're full of hardcore loyalists to the president, right? So if let's say they tried to commit a fraud in the election, or like the election is actually close and they might lose, there's a high chance that those military forces will be deployed under some other pretext, of course, like maintaining security, and that they will repress any mass protest. And they don't use rubber bullets in Honduras. They use live ammo, right? That's why so many people die in the protests here. So yeah, that's kind of what's at stake tomorrow. We'll see how it goes. On the one hand, you could maybe have the end of an era, the post-coup era. Not all the problems will be fixed, but it'll be a new era. And the other, it's going to like go straight to military dictatorship.
Isn't there a worry that even if, the other candidate that the military don't like gets in, that they're just going to do another coup? Like, surely, they hold all the power. It's in every interest for them to hold the power. And also they've been given the green light by, the most powerful country on earth, America. Surely they'll just, if someone that isn't agreeable to them gets in, they'll just go, okay, coup number 2 or whatever. Like, won't that just happen?
I think that's a possibility. The one thing is that I think that there is a certain heightened scrutiny from the U.S. right now. And I have to clarify what the scrutiny is, because, it's not like the U.S. has suddenly become this benevolent, watchman over Honduras, right? But ever since basically the revelations that the state is the total narco state came when the brother of the current president was arrested in Miami in 2018, right? And it turns out that he was arrested on weapons and drug trafficking charges. And it turns out he was using the Honduran military and police, who, by the way, are supported heavily by the U.S., to traffic drugs into the U.S., right? And ever since then, basically, the Honduran government has become this awkward glitch in the facade of the drug war, right? Where it's like these same forces charged with fighting drugs are themselves trafficking drugs while also killing people. And it's kind of an embarrassment for the U.S. at this point, because it's not that they suddenly are benevolent towards Latin America, right? But they're kind of like, oh my God, what do we do with this guy? Because, there's heightened scrutiny, right? There's like far more media attention than there was 5 years ago. Not that it's that much to begin with. So I think it's less likely that they will go with a coup right afterwards, because they don't want to have their U.S. aid cut off. And the U.S., I think, would consider pulling back on the aid simply because they don't want to have such an embarrassing ally drawing attention to just generally how fucked up U.S. policy is in Central America, which, Kamala Harris and company say that they're fighting root causes, quote unquote. It's total bullshit. It's more of the same. Yeah, but like they don't want it to look bad. And it would be a really bad look if a narco state they support did a second coup to stay in power, or a second coup to come back to power. So possibility, but I think that they might try to find more subtle ways to stay in power. I do agree, though, that the military and kind of the revanchist oligarchic sectors in Honduras will try to somehow fight back against Xiomara Castro, if she becomes president, no doubt.
Right, like I can just see it, even if, okay, maybe they don't do another coup, but I can just imagine a lot of that, the military will probably just become the paramilitary. You know what I'm saying? It does seem ripe for that, from what I've heard anyway.
Yeah, I think this is something that happens also in a lot of Latin America in general. Mexico is super complicated, right? But, a lot of these countries that like have very powerful military forces but aren't technically at war is that the military is essentially this massive, well-equipped gang, right, with uniforms. Like ever since the 80s, they've been involved in corruption and drug trafficking, weapons smuggling, right? And they are like almost an oligarchic class unto themselves, right? And they don't like the idea that they're not going to have power, even though, like, why the fuck does Honduras need a military, right? It's like the size of Florida, and they're not fighting any official war, aside from killing their own people when they need to, So I think that, yeah, that's kind of a very real fear, is that like this group, which is extremely well equipped, supported by the United States, and has been trained by US troops frequently, is just going to find a way to somehow remain in power. Or they're going to force, if Castro wins, right, they're going to force her to concede to their presence and to be like, you're not fucking with us or else we'll get rid of you. And then that creates all sorts of problems too,
Yeah, it's not looking like anything's going to go very smoothly. No. Is there anything else you want to mention here, mate, before we kind of move on from this?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's kind of two things connected in one, right? A lot of media coverage, but especially like around the early 2010s, right? Like after the coup in Honduras, there was kind of this tendency, especially for people who would like show up in Honduras for 3 days and then never come back, to paint the violence in the country as being driven mostly by gangs, right? With the subtext being that, the violence in the country is being driven by like these savage poor people, look at the criminality. The criminality is out of control, right? But I think what you can see with the rise of these paramilitary groups, with the mass extrajudicial killings, with the repression carried out by the Honduran military and the Honduran police, and the fact that those same groups are themselves trafficking drugs, shows that it's state violence. It's not this criminal wave, and that we need to strengthen the state so that they can fight the evil criminals, the evil gangsters. No, it is the state itself being supported directly by the United States that is very often driving migrants out of Honduras in such colossal numbers.
Yeah, man, definitely. It's a very sad situation. All right, mate. Where can people find your work if they want to and follow you and, see your reporting from Honduras?
Yeah, definitely. I had a website went down recently, but most of my work is accessible via my Twitter, J Olson 321. JOLSON 321. And yeah, so I'm writing for The Intercept's Foreign Policy, The Nation. You can go find those articles there. But yeah, so feel free to go read some of those reports, right? And there's some other people who speak Spanish can read the reports from Contracorrientes. There's some other great journalists who do some good work down here as well.
All right, mate. Appreciate it. Stay safe out there, man.
All right. Thanks, man.
Cheers, mate. That was Jared Olson speaking about the narco-paramilitaries of Honduras and the widespread corruption and problems that are in that country, in a large part thanks to the US-backed military coup. Obviously, we recorded this before the election, but you'll be hearing this after the election. So just so you know, the result is that the opposition that Jared was talking about, she won. So there you go. There's the election results. If you like what we're doing here at Popular Front, please consider supporting us at patreon.com/popularfront. That is the main way we make money. We have been censored off of YouTube. We're not allowed to advertise there, despite some of our documentaries having more than 2.5 million views. We make no money from that. We're not allowed to promote our stuff on Instagram either. We can't make any money that way. So the way we make money, because we refuse corporate investment, is on the Patreon. Patreon.com/popularfront. There's loads of extras there. £5 a month, £10 a month, whatever. You get access to the community Discord, monthly bonus episodes that are only on the Patreon. There's all sorts there. Check it out. Patreon.com/popularfront. Or if you want to support us in another way via crypto or whatever, go to popularfront.co/support. You will see all of the details there. This episode was sponsored by Oracle Coffee Shop. in Portland, Oregon, USA. They're an independent coffee shop, coffee business, selling only fair trade products. See them at 3875 South West Bond Avenue 97239. The episode was also sponsored by our friends at Grindcore House. That's a pair of independent coffee shops in Philadelphia, USA, one in South, one in West. Find them on socials at Grindcore House. The episode was also sponsored by Propagandopolis, an outlet selling and writing about historical conflict propaganda from around the world. You can buy prints at propagandopolis.com. Use promo code POPULARFRONT10 for 10% off. If you want to advertise with us and you're ethical, you're independent, let us know. You can email me at hanrahan@pm.me. So HANRAHAN@pm.me. We have over 3 million unique downloads. We get a lot of listeners. So if you're interested and you think that will match up, drop me a line. If you want to follow us on social media, watch our documentaries, youtube.com/popularfront, Instagram @popular.front, Twitter @popularfront_. Just check our website out at popularfront.co. Remember as well to follow our backup account on the Instagram, because we're threatened with being deleted every single week, basically because we show the news through an unfiltered way, and we believe that it's important to show the world the real aspects of war and conflict as it is. So follow the backup at popularfront_. Music in this episode, the intro was by Home and the outro was by Sam Black. Check Sam's music out at samblackpf.com. Sam is a massive part of Popular Front. Without him, we wouldn't be able to do this, so definitely check his music out, share it, everything like that. samblackpf.com. Thank you very much to the higher tier patrons. Without you, this would not be possible. I mean it. Thanks for staying with us all of this time. Really do appreciate it. There's big things coming next year. Thank you to RA, Champagne Anarchist, Thwat, Elise Middlefart, Jess, Lewis or Louis, David McManus, Joaquin Williamson Holt, Yudoye Travis. Check him out, he's a comedian. I was looking on his Instagram the other day, he's very funny. Check him out, Yudoye Travis. Thank you to Tom Petrie, James Leons, Kate, Lisa Milgram. Excuse me, sorry, I'm dying. I'm really ill, apologies. Bradley Davies, Brendan Crave, Pete Hesher, X, A. Nicole, Travis Lieberman, Cherry, Ben Marshall, Dallas Dunn, LD50 Seattle, excuse me, MJ, K. Glitter Vulcan, Meredith Waters, Bethany Swoveland, Adam H, Karante, Bjorn Kirsten, Diamond Steen, Michael O'Connor, Zach Packard, Todd Cravens, Nicholas Butter, Ron Swanson, JD, Jav, Ian Frois, James Cully, Tynan Daly, Ethan, Fitz Madrid, Ed Coulthard, Mike Barone, Ben, Liam Williams, Chris Cusimano, Degenerate Zero Alpha, Giorgio Arani, DR, Trey Nance, Amy R, Rubicon, Frank Austin, Amelia Me, Nawaiz, Nate Van Dor, Christina Rivetti, Freya Northman, Ali Hunter, Andrew Hurley, Vida Provost, Brian McLaughlin, Tom Lochrin, Young Wasabi, Tony Bin, Adam Bergsnyder, JL, Stephen Davila, Anthony Kabarak, Dan Dunham, Fletcher, Diana Gorvanek, Lawrence Abrahams, Peter McCormick from What Bitcoin Did, Axel Iverson, Christopher Martin at Shady Project, Ryan Sandercock, and Moritz Zumbul. Thank you all so much. Really appreciate it. Without you lot, this would not be moving as fast as it is. Trust me, next year we're doing a lot. It's going to be really good. Thanks.